Hello and welcome to Louise Singleton Creations. In today's video I'm going to be making a resin side table with a difference. This table has a big hole right in the middle, which on its own might look a little bit strange, but that hole makes it multifunctional. You can put a plant pot into the hole so that it's just resting on its rim on the surface of the table so that it's recessed into the table, and that looks very good. But you could also use a water fountain for the garden table. You could even have an ice bucket to keep your drinks cold. The possibilities are endless. So if you would like to see how you can easily make one of these tables without the use of any power tools, stay tuned and enjoy the video. For my table, I'm using my 20-inch tabletop silicone mould from Let's Resin. I've used it quite a lot already. You might have seen the other videos and I love it. The first time I used it, I made this template, which is why it's so scruffy, but it still works. And I divided it into 3, as you can see, so that I knew where to position my table legs later on, because you can just put it behind the mould and still see your markings. I've just marked where I want to put my hole in the middle, and for the hole I'm using a large silicone cake mould. Right then, my template is behind the mould and I'm just positioning it because I made it a little bit too small, so I'm just making sure it's central, and then I can add my silicone cake mould to the middle. It was a little bit awkward to make sure it was central. I just had to look at it from all angles to make sure it reached those marks which I put on my template, but then it was in position. Today I'm going to be adding pebbles into my resin, so I had a lot ready which I'd already washed, and yeah, I just filled that silicone cake mould in the middle just to make sure it was nicely weighed down, and that way hopefully the resin wouldn't seep underneath too much. I expected it to go underneath a little bit, but yeah, adding those pebbles really weighs it down nicely. Right then, I had around 600 grams of epoxy resin already prepared. It's a little bit yellow, and that is because I wanted to use up all my old resin. I have quite a lot of resin and some bottles have been open for a while. Once you've opened your bottles of epoxy resin, it only has a certain amount of life in it. You know, you need to use it within a few months, otherwise it starts to go yellow. And it has a little bit with this one. And so I thought, well, let's use up all my old resin. I don't mind that it's gone that little shade of yellow. You can't actually tell once it's poured and cured. It just looks very clear. And so I'm using Resin Pro's transparent resin for this. I would have liked to have made this video just Let's Resin products. I have some Let's Resin resin, but it's quite new and I didn't want to use it all up. And yeah, I'm just using up all my last little bits. And what you can see me doing here is adding some stones to it and giving it a stir. The idea was to coat them, but in the end I didn't do that so much. I just put them in dry into the resin once it was in the mould. But the idea was to just give them a real good coat to make sure they were already coated, and I added them that way. So then I just put it all into the mould, as you can see, and this is why I ended up just adding them in dry, because obviously my jug wasn't big enough to put all the stones that I was going to use in there. So yeah, it only filled it partially, and so that's why that idea didn't work quite so well. But anyway, what you can see me doing now is just moving them all around to fit the space. I'm going to fast forward towards the end of it in a moment, because obviously it took me quite a while. I'm stealing some stones from the middle as well. There were some stones when I was washing them because once they're wet, as you can see, the patterns really come out so nicely. You can see all the details once they're covered in resin. And when I washed them, there were some that really stood out as being really beautiful stones, so I'd kept those separate to make sure that they went into the table. But I did end up pinching some from the middle as well. Right then, as I said before, I'd marked out on that template, which is behind the mould, where I want my leg brackets to go, because the hairpin legs, which I'm using, have a separate bracket that you can add, and then you add the legs afterwards. And I wanted a flat surface to attach those to in the next step, because this is just the first layer. I'm doing the table in 2 layers. And so what I did was I found the smallest and flattest stones that I had to place in that area, so that the resin would form a flat surface, and then it would be much easier for me to attach the brackets in the next step. So that was the idea. The only problem was that these stones were all quite big and round, and there were not so many of the small flat ones. But yeah, I took my time and I found the smallest ones I could to make sure those 3 patches where the legs would be going were as flat as possible. So I've stepped forward in time to when I'd almost finished with all my arranging, and you might be able to tell just in 3 spaces I've got the stones nice and shallow and a more flat surface where the resin is settling on the top to a nice flat surface. Hopefully you can see that anyway. But yeah, I was quite pleased with it in the end and knew that I'd be able to place my brackets fairly easily onto those 3 patches. Right, the next day the first layer was cured and it was time to add the brackets. I've just slowed it down a little bit just to show you in detail the thing you've got to think about with the brackets. Now, you see that hole on the side? That needs to be above the resin when the table is complete, because that's where the legs attach, and I didn't want the resin going past that hole. And so I needed to check the level of my resin to see if that would happen, to see if the resin would go through that hole if I just placed them on as they are. So I put my ruler across the top of the mould and looked from the side to see if the resin would go past the hole or if it wouldn't. And I found that it would be situated too low down if I just attached the brackets to the resin at this stage. And so I took a dry wipe pen just to mark out where the holes were, so I had a rough idea of the position of the bracket, and then I used some hot melt glue with my glue gun to make some mounds of glue to attach the brackets to, so that it would be elevated and not too low in the mould. If I was using much smaller stones, this project would have been a lot easier because it would have been a level surface, and yeah, I wouldn't have had all those lumps and bumps sticking out everywhere. But I do love those big stones, so I was still glad I used them. The best thing about using all these stones, which was my main reason actually for using them, is that you don't need as much resin. You just need a fraction of the amount actually, and the fact that there's going to be a big hole in the middle as well also reduces the amount of resin that you're going to be using. So if you've ever thought you'd like to make a table using one of these moulds but didn't want to use up all that resin, this would be a great idea for you. Okay then, so once I'd applied multiple blobs of hot melt glue on top of each other to elevate the bracket, and I'd checked that it was, all nice and level and in the right place, I added a little bit more glue and then attached the bracket. And it's not a really strong join, but it doesn't need to be. It's just there to stop it moving around when I add the resin in the next step. I repeated the process for the other 2 brackets, and then I did exactly the same thing with the stones and epoxy resin for the final layer. My original plan was to add the hairpin legs when the whole tabletop was finished, but I was kind of concerned that I would struggle to get the hairpin legs in once the second layer of stones and resin was applied. I didn't want any of the big stones hindering the angle in which I needed to add the hairpin legs, if that makes any sense to you. So what I decided to do at last minute was add the legs before applying this layer of stones and resin. And once all the resin and stones were in, those brackets were encased in resin, and so they would not come out, they would not move once that resin was cured, which saves you from having to screw the brackets into the tabletop, because you can imagine trying to drill holes for those brackets through the stones would not be a good idea. So yeah, I've encased them in the resin and they are going to be there forever. Right then, the next day it was fully cured and it was time to get it out of the mould. So first of all, I took the red silicone mould out of the middle, and I could see that some of the resin had seeped through, but it was a very thin layer and I knew that that would be easy to get off. And then I just folded the legs in. There was a little bit of resin stuck to the legs in places and I had to give it a tight squeeze to, dislodge it. But yeah, it was fine. They folded in fine. So once I could fold the legs in, I turned it over and removed the silicone mould. When the legs are folded like that, you can quite clearly see that I didn't place my brackets perfectly, but you couldn't tell. You couldn't tell that it wasn't perfectly in the right position once the table was in position, if that makes sense. Anyway, once it was turned over, it was very easy to take the mould off. I just released it all the way around the edges and gradually removed it. When the mould was off, I was so happy with the results. I love how you can see all the different shades and textures in those stones, and there's some really interesting patterns as well. And as you can see, that excess resin on the inside is very thin and bendy. Most of it just filed off, but the rest just came off with a knife. And then it was time to take it out into the sunshine and try it out with my plant pot. And here it is before adding my plants, and you can see in the daylight that it's nice and clear and you can see the details quite well. Well, you could if it wasn't for all that reflection. But yeah, it looked so nice when I got it outside. And a lot of you might be wondering about it yellowing over time, because epoxy resin will yellow in the sunlight. Over time, it's inevitable. That will happen. But I can update you maybe like in a year's time. So if I haven't done an update, in the top of the comments, I'll pin a comment to tell you how it's doing. If you're watching this a year after I uploaded it, remind me please, and I will let you know how it's looking. So here's the first one that I tried. This is the terracotta pot, which was the plan for this table. That's what I did my measurements from, and so that's why I used that size of cake mould. It was for that particular pot, but I did find other pots that would fit in the hole. Here is one of my house plants, which I borrowed from the house just for the photography purposes. It went back inside afterwards, as did the other one with the red flowers that you saw. And yeah, that one fitted really well. In fact, it fitted better than the terracotta pot, and I was really pleased with it. As you can see, if you look carefully, you can see how deep that pot is and how low it hangs under the table. So yeah, it's really versatile, this table. So once I tried it with my plant pots, I got a little bit more creative. I found a silver bowl from the kitchen. Well, not silver, you know what I mean. Silver coloured bowl. I'm not that rich to have silver bowls. Anyway, I found a metal bowl from the kitchen and put my solar fountain in there. I pinched it from its proper place just to see what would happen. And it did work. However, really, if I was going to use it as a fountain, the hole would need to be bigger and I would use a wider bowl because it, as you can probably see, it was splashing onto the table. So you would need a wider hole for this idea. But it still worked really well. I really love that, especially with the stones in there that match the table. What do you think? I really like that. And here's a little view from underneath so that you can see the size of the bowl that I used. That bowl actually fitted perfectly. It was like it was made to fit. So there's some ideas for the garden. Let's take it inside now and see how I can use this inside the house. Right then, so we're inside and I've got my silver bowl back again, and this time I'm going to use some floating candles. I think this would work better if the bowl was a different colour. It doesn't really complement the table brilliantly for this purpose, but it's enough to show you the idea, and I think it works really nicely having the floating candles in there. And with the lights dimmed and a nice bottle of wine, I think it sets the scene nicely for a romantic evening in. And if you're in the mood for a movie night, it works really well for snacks, and I'm thinking a big tub of popcorn would work well too. And after the party's over, you can put your houseplant back in there for a really beautiful look. I think the houseplant idea is actually my favourite. Well, it's that time again. We've come to the end of the video, and I must say I had a lot of fun with this one, and I'm sure my mind will carry on coming up with other ideas for the uses of this table. I hope you've been inspired, and I hope you're going to have a go yourself. All the links will be in the description, so head on over to Let's Resin and have a look at the table mould, and the world is your oyster. So that's it for today. I will see you again next week. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.